mathematician works, he doesn't just consider the triangle on the blackboard. He tries to imagine all kinds of triangles in imagination, deforming the triangle, putting it this way or this way or this way or this way, okay? Many triangles. For instance, here, you have many triangles. So he makes a variation in his mind, in his imagination, and then tries to extract the properties that belong to all of these imagined triangles, all of them, the most general properties of triangles. And then one can say that, a mathematician has reached, I quote Husserl, the essence of the triangle, namely the property that is most general and belong to all triangles that you have seen in your imagination. So the procedure that is used by mathematicians, concrete human mathematicians, according to Husserl, is the procedure called eidetic, I will explain that after, eidetic variation, one, and second, extracting invariance from these variations. So eidetic variation means varying the idea, okay? You vary the idea. And then you extract what doesn't vary across all the numbers of all the varieties, for instance, of mathematical objects, and especially, for example, the variety of triangles. Okay, so what is a property that belongs to all triangles? Here you have such a property. You see that the sum of the angles of a triangle is always 180 degrees. Namely, it's a flat angle. Okay? You see it immediately by seeing this picture. You see that even if you vary the angle of the triangle, the sum of the angles will always be 180 degrees. It will always be a flat angle. Okay? So this property of triangles doesn't depend on the particular triangle you choose in your mind. It is universal. It holds in all circumstances, for all triangles, for all human beings, and in every country of the world. Okay? This is a mathematical property. It is universal, it is intersubjective, and yet it has been produced by human minds. Okay? This is the first discovery, I think, of Husserl. So what Husserl did was, first of all, what Husserl did was trying to find something similar, not in mathematical objects, but in experience itself. What are the invariants of experience? So vary all the states of mind you want. What is something that characterizes all the states of mind? This is called the essence of a mental state. Husserl was looking for the essence of mental states, namely what doesn't vary across the variation of mental states. What is absolutely common to every mental state? One of these universal features that Husserl found was intentionality. Every mental state is characterized by being about something, by attention towards something, towards achieving something. Maybe it's like a little bit like some of the first links of dependent origination, namely desire, attraction, just that. Aiming at. For instance, here he describes quite well what is intentionality. In this very early text of Husserl, you find that in the natural attitude, namely in the standard normal attitude of human beings, the except when they meditate, by the way. The interest is not at rest. It makes an effort to evade it. You see, it's interesting. When you are in a state of mind, you make an effort to evade the state of mind. Maybe it's exactly what meditation strives to avoid, that we escape the state in which we are, just dwell into the state. But here, in the natural attitude, the non-meditative attitude, we make an effort to evade our own state of mind. This gives rise to an intention, a tensed interest towards something else, which strives towards something, striving, craving, okay? If this something doesn't occur, for instance, if our expectation is not fulfilled, we are dissatisfied. If it occurs, we are satisfied. You see, we strive towards something, we expect something, and we wait. If it happens, we say, okay, now I am satisfied. Not for very long, for just 1 second. And then a new interest, a new striving, and so on. But when the thing we expected doesn't occur, we are dissatisfied. The idea of phenomenology is to relax this fundamental tension and to devote interest to the mental processes by which objects are picked out from the fleeting appearances. So instead of aiming towards an object, please relax and observe yourself aiming towards objects. That's exactly the basic move of phenomenology. Instead of rushing towards objects, rest and observe yourself rushing towards objects. Okay? So here is how phenomenology was born. But what is phenomenology? According to the Stanford Encyclopedia, which gives a definition which is not very accurate but which is simple, phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first-person point of view. So it gives an idea, because you understand that phenomenology is a study of consciousness by itself. But it gives the impression that, you know, we take consciousness as an object and we see it from the point of view of a subject. So this definition is a little bit dualist. Merleau-Ponty gave a definition that is a little bit more metaphorical, but is quite interesting. According to Merleau-Ponty, we do phenomenology when we come back to that world before knowledge, compared to which any scientific determination is abstract, just as geography is with regard to landscape. So, the idea of phenomenology is just forget knowledge, suspend knowledge, any kind of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, including common knowledge, any kind of knowledge, and just be with what you are at this very moment. And compared to that, scientific determinations is abstract. And here you see Merleau-Ponty compare scientific knowledge and phenomenological knowledge by a metaphor. The metaphor is the comparison between the map and the landscape. Scientists can be said to draw a map of experience. Instead, phenomenologists just explore the landscape of experience. Okay? So this is the difference between the two. The map is abstract, the landscape is concrete. Moreover, phenomenology, it's very important to understand that phenomenology is a discipline of pure description of experience, but with no explanations or metaphysical doctrines. A phenomenologist doesn't attempt to explain, if it's possible, by the way, the origin of experiences. it takes experience as it is and it describes it. Okay? And a phenomenologist would add, how can you dare think that you can explain experience? It's just absurd, because experience is where explanations make sense. It cannot be taken as an object of experience. Okay? So the reason why phenomenology doesn't try to explain experience is that, according to most phenomenologists, it would just be a sort of antinomy to try to explain experience, because an explanation would be itself an experience. I feel that the explanation is satisfactory. This is an experience. Now, the method. There is a method of phenomenology in order to reach this connection with the landscape of experience. The method was called the epoche, namely the suspension, the cessation, the suspension of verbal judgments. But not only verbal judgments, also perceptual judgments. Please notice, and this is not just by chance, that there is an analogy of meaning between the Greek word epoche and the Sanskrit word nirodha. You know that it's a case in Buddhism and in Hinduism that there is nirodha. In Buddhism, in the cessation of suffering, I think it's the third noble truth. And in Hinduism, you have a second aphorism of Yoga Sutras that says yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. That means yoga is the cessation of the mental processes. So the same for phenomenology. Phenomenology advocates as a first step the suspension or cessation not only of verbal judgments but also perceptual judgments. Now, I told you that this connection between epoche and nirodha is probably not by chance. In fact, it was the first Greek author who used this word epoche in the sense of suspension of judgment was Pyrrho, the main author of Greek skepticism. Pyrrho was not any Greek philosopher. He was the Greek philosopher who accompanied Alexander in the 4th century BC to India. And Pyrrho wrote about Indian thinkers. He said, yes, I met there some thinkers and I discussed with them, we had exchange and so on and so on. And he brought back a doctrine which was amazingly similar to Buddhism with some little touches of Hinduism, actually. So it's interesting. So he practiced epoche, and according to Pyrrho, epoche, namely suspension of judgment, yielded ataraxia. Ataraxia in Greek. What does it mean? Peace of the mind. No, suspending judgment yields peace of the mind. So clearly you have a connection here between Greece and India. And interestingly, Husserl, without knowing all these things, borrowed the word epoche from Pyrrho and transformed it into a method of phenomenology, suspend judgment. So relax tensions towards objects, neutralize any preverbal beliefs also. Okay? For instance, when here I look at this glass, the first, if I'm not very trained in, for instance, in Zen or something like that, I immediately see that as something that I can use in order to pour water. But according to Husserl, you have to suspend this also and just see it as it is, a glittering thing, mysterious, with no, on which you have not yet superimposed the idea of its use. Okay. This is the move of the first move of phenomenology. Then Husserl says that we first have to lose the world with the epoche. Lose the world with the epoche. Namely, no longer see glasses as glasses, but glasses as what they are. Namely, as I told you, presences. But we have to lose the world with the epoche to conquer it anew in a universal self-examination. Namely, once we have suspended all kinds of judgments, then we examine what is left. Pure experience, this feeling of strange, glittering things, but also impulses. We feel impulses towards something. And then when we gather all these pieces, we see how the belief in the existence and use of concrete objects is fabricated. It's fabricated out of collection of phenomena, formation of invariance, and finally, striving towards, namely intentionality. But of course, the problem of Husserl is that he never said how to perform the epoche. This is one of the deepest, missing things in Husserl. Almost no indications about how to proceed in order to suspend judgment. He felt that it was something really important, decisive. Probably he did that personally. But how can you do that? He didn't say. So the future phenomenologists had a problem with that, the phenomenologists who followed Husserl. Emmanuel Levinas, a French phenomenologist, understood that. He said, the epoche is an inner revolution, a way of freeing oneself from the world. But here again, he didn't say how to do that. So much so that I must say, in the present day state of phenomenology, many phenomenologists are skeptical about the epoche. Because they say, oh, maybe, well, how do you do that? We don't know. And Husserl, maybe he did that, maybe he did not. He said he did that, but how can we be sure? And so on and so on. So it's a problem. It's a problem because if there is a clear indication of what it is to be done, but not how it has to be done. And to me, it's clear that there is a strong field of collaboration between phenomenology and Buddhism, because Buddhism has the techniques, the methods to reach a state of real suspension of judgment. Then, when you have performed the suspension of judgment, okay, when you are a Buddhist, you don't do many more things. But when you are a phenomenologist, you should redirect your attention inwards and examine what is left after the epoche. You examine the states of mind. Of course, you could say there is analytic meditation in Buddhism that precisely is meant to examine moment after moment what happens in the mind. But the purpose is not to examine what is occurring in the mind. It's to free oneself from this process by way of analysis. Instead, the aim of phenomenology is analysis and description of what is analyzed in the mind. And this redirection of attention inwards is called the reduction by Husserl. After the epoche, you perform the reduction, the phenomenological reduction. But what is a reduction? Reduction is suspending, after having suspended beliefs, you keep a certain level of a certain domain and you study it. For instance, empiricism would say, okay, I suspend belief in external objects, as David Hume did, but I still accept that there are sensations, and I study sensations. So this is the sensualistic variety of empiricism. You can also do the psychological reduction, namely you reduce everything to mental activity taken as an object of study. And therefore, you say, I study the way ordinary objects come to be believed in by people. But still, you still believe in something when you perform only the psychological reduction. You still believe in the existence of mental states. You take them as objects. And Husserl wanted to get rid even of this layer of belief, even the belief in mental states. But just belief, no belief in fact, just dwelling in the present state of consciousness. This is what he called the phenomenological reduction to transcendental consciousness. So it's a deeper reduction with respect to psychological reduction, even though it bears some similarities to psychological reduction. Okay, so but what is the transcendental? What is it? Strangely, the text in which I found the most wonderful and accurate definition of the transcendental dates back to the 8th century BC, and it comes from India. It is the text of the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. And this sentence is said about the Brahman. Okay? So, what is the Brahman? Asks the student. And the teacher, the teacher is probably called Yajnavalkya. The teacher answers, what is the Brahman? It is never seen, but it is the seer. It is never heard, but is the hearer. It is never thought, but is the thinker. It is never known, but is the knower. Okay? So what is it? It is not something here, there. It is not something you can point towards. It is not something you can intentionally direct your gaze towards. It is the source of all these intentions, glimpses, and so on. So the idea of Husserl is to come back to the source itself. And you see that it's a very challenging task because each time he tries to describe what he finds by this move, he is threatened by what he called himself psychologism, namely taking what he describes as an object and forgetting that what he tries to reach is below the level of objects. Okay? So it's a difficulty. And Husserl is very aware of this difficulty. He always says, oh no, I've gone astray, I must come back and be more careful, and so on and so on. That's the reason, to a certain extent, why there are so long and so cumbersome writings by Husserl. It's because he always comes back and back again and again on the same topic in order to be sure that he is not doing the mistake of psychologism and really sticking to the transcendental realm of consciousness. Okay, what does one discover in the reduced domain? So here again, words are missing. That's a difficulty for a guy who wants to put words on that. And probably it's part of the contradiction of Husserl's undertaking, but let's see. So when Husserl arrives at a reduced domain, he is a little bit disoriented. He has never seen such a realm. When we explore our pure original life, he said, we are initially in a position bearing analogy with that of a blind man who has just recovered his sight and must orient himself in an unknown realm. So you are like a blind person who has just opened the eyes and see something completely new, completely unheard, completely uninterpreted, without conceptual superimpositions. And I found this text in a book by Arthur Zaehns about meditation. which is very similar to Husserl's remarks. At the outset of our practice of meditation, he said, we are like the blind boy who has new experiences but no way to understand them. So meditation brings exactly to the state in which the epoche brings the phenomenologist, namely a state of disorientation, a state of lack of conceptual, conceptual marks, landmarks. And here is further characterization of Husserl, who compares the state of someone who has performed the epoche to a baby who has not yet thought about what he is or she is saying. Imagine a pristine consciousness. It can experience the same things as we do, but it doesn't apprehend concrete things, neither flowers, nor houses, nor the flight of a bird. For such consciousness, a really pristine consciousness, sensations mean nothing. They do not have the value of signs of an object. They are merely lived through. For us, when we have a sensation, is the sign that we can do something with what we see. But for a pristine consciousness, maybe a baby-like consciousness, there is no such thing. Sensations are sensations. Present is present, and that's it. Nothing more. And Husserl wants to come back to that state. The only difference is that in that state, a phenomenologist is not just enjoying the view. The phenomenologist should be aware that he or she has reached a new state of consciousness and tries to study it. That's the point, and that's the difficulty. Okay? At the same time, trying to find this pristine state of consciousness and yet have the mind alert and try to explore, to see, to analyze, and so on. Now, this idea that every belief in external bodies come from the mind, and that bodies, in fact, are just what we believe in when we have organized certain aspects of our mind. This way of thinking has been called an idealism, a variety of idealism. And it's very close, obviously, with the mind-only school of Buddhism. And here are some sentences by Husserl that make absolutely no difficulty in believing that he is an idealist. For instance, even the idea of a world which exists intrinsically before my knowledge of it, before I become conscious of it, exists only for me and relative to me. Okay? The idea of an external world is internal to me. Okay? The belief that the world exists independently of me depends on me. This can hardly be more idealist, I think. And this is a polemical answer to certain people, certain philosophers, modern philosophers, who try to save, so to speak, Husserl from the accusation of idealism by saying, no, he was not an idealist. In fact, it was more subtle and so on. Really, when you read such sentence, I think you have no doubt. Or this sentence, I am the only one who created this world, which exists for me and also myself as a human being. Okay? Even myself as a human being has been created by me, because a human being is a natural being, and me is the field of consciousness. Or this sentence, there is no nature, except insofar as it is constituted in an ordered process of consciousness. This is absolutely unmistakably a form of idealism. But, in fact, indeed, Husserl is more subtle than that. But it doesn't mean that he's a realist after all. It means that Husserl is a non-dualist. He's neither an idealist nor a materialist, but a non-dualist. And here is what makes it clear. This is idealism, because clearly Husserl accepts that he can be called an idealist, is not a metaphysical view. It's not the view that only mind exists and not matter. Okay? It is the only possible and absolute truth of someone who recollects into her own doings. So this idealist is not a claim of existence. It's not the claim that only consciousness exists. It's a claim of method. It just says, look, where are we? We are conscious beings. So we should start from where we are. And all the rest, any further beliefs, must be grounded into this present moment of consciousness. It's just a statement of method. And so we could call that a methodological idealism, but there are many other texts in which Husserl speaks of, the correlation between subject and object in an act of intentionality, which you can read as, in Buddhist terms, as subject and object are dependently arising in a common relation that is called intentionality. So I think now we should have the pause. So now we come to another point. It's the vision of science that Husserl had. You will see that it's a very critical vision, so much so that some people have said, oh, Husserl is against science. But how could he be against science since he was a scientist himself? It's not true. It's not true. He was just advocating lucidity. He was just advocating that scientists become lucid about the origin of their own knowledge. That's it. And the origin of their own knowledge is consciousness. That's the only point. So according to Husserl, Galileo, I quote him, Galileo was at once a discovering and a concealing genius. So he has discovered the modern science, nothing less. Modern physics. You have seen that last days, okay? But he was also a concealing genius. Why? Because he was a scientist who strived towards objectivity. And striving towards objectivity means forgetting the one who is constructing the objective knowledge. Forgetting that building stable items, stable sets of phenomena is an act of consciousness. Okay? And for instance, Husserl said that Galileo concealed the origin of knowledge by substituting the mathematical world of idealities for the only real world, our life world. What does it mean? He means that scientists tend to think that what is most real is the object depicted by, or supposedly depicted by, their mathematical formalisms or by their concepts. And they forget that all these concepts, all this mathematical stuff is based on our life world, the life world of concrete experience, of concrete situations. You remember that Husserl was interested in understanding the origin of mathematics in the acts of variation of figures and picking out invariants out of these variation of figures. So he was a mathematician, and yet he didn't forget that mathematics was a product of minds. And he wanted other scientists to do the same, to be lucid about the fact that their knowledge is the product of their minds and consciousness. Another quote, this subjective is supposed to be overcome. Namely, the idea of scientists sometimes is to say, okay, we want to get rid with all this subjectivity. We want to only to see the objective world. So we overcome the subjective to reach the objective. However, says Husserl, the subjective is functioning not as something irrelevant that must be passed through, but as that which ultimately grounds the theoretical validity for all objective verification. Okay? So you cannot just forget the subjective, because the subjective is precisely the place in which you can do the tests, you can convince yourself, you can compare the various items in perception, in mental work, and so on and so on. It's in the realm of consciousness that all this work that is so important for science goes on. So trying to forget the subjective in favor of the objective, and even as some try to do nowadays, even trying to show how the subjective is born from the objective, according to Husserl, it's a complete mistake. And that's the reason why, in fact, the aim of this game cannot be reached. We cannot see how the subjective can arise from the objective, because the objective is just a byproduct of a work within the subject. So why, now people can ask, but why this impulse is so strong? Why do we strive desperately to forget our own lived realm and to stick to our abstractions, and to think that our abstractions are more real than the concrete life we live? How is it? Michel Henry had an answer. Michel Henry is a French phenomenologist, and I told you that you should read a book called Incarnation by Michel Henry. So he said, the reason why people desperately strive towards the objective is that they want to negate their own lives. Why? Because their own lives is full of suffering. Life negates itself in objective knowledge to escape its own anxiety and suffering. So here is the first noble truth. Okay? There is suffering, and there are many strategies to avoid suffering. One of them is to forget oneself, forget this little, place in which anxieties and so on come to the fore, and just paying attention to ideas, to external entities, and so on and so on. So we forget ourselves. So it's one of the strategies to overcome suffering. And moreover, second element of this strategy, the results of this activity of escaping oneself can be a technology that is useful to overcome the suffering of the body. But the fundamental suffering, the existential suffering, gets untouched by this strategy. Okay? So it's clear that the diagnosis of the reason why we tend to escape ourselves has been done by the phenomenologists. But the cure was not clear for us, and I think the cure is close to Buddhism. The real cure to the real cause, ultimate cause of suffering. Now, what about our bodies? Our bodies, I told you, I can doubt even of my body. Yet, when I study carefully my body, I find that it's really a very, very special kind of thing. It's not an ordinary thing. when I touch a table, the table, I feel something like the contact of the table, but I don't feel the table feeling anything. Instead, when I take my hand, it's very different. I touch my hand. I have the feeling of having touched my hand in my finger. But my hand has also felt something. So this hand is at the same time felt and feeling. This hand has a double face, not in space, of course, but in sensations. This hand is both touching and touched, sensing and sensed. We could say my body is simultaneously subject and object. It's subject because I can see it. It's subject because it's seeing everything. It's from there that we see everything. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist, but used a term for that. He said, my body is made of a very special stuff that can be called the flesh. The flesh is defined by Merleau-Ponty as a double-faced entity. Double-faced because it's capable of sensing just as much as being sensed. So, this tradition of French phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, Michel-Henry, and so on, have gone quite deep into the analysis of the body. According to Michel-Henry, when we suspend judgment, we go upstream, even intentionality. For him, there are states of consciousness in which intentionality doesn't even exist. Contrary to what Husserl said, who said intentionality is always there. According to Michel-Henry, there are experiences, such as, for instance, pleasure and pain, when pleasure is pure pleasure, pain is exquisite, horrible pain, but there is no object, neither of pleasure nor of the pain. That can happen, not always, but that may happen. And in that case, you have a state of consciousness without tension, without trying to ascribe the feeling to an object. And this is what Michel-Henry calls the self-impression of the flesh. Namely, for instance, when you feel pleasure, sometimes you feel pleasure just being there, not really having something special, a good drink or anything. Just being there is maybe a bliss, just for a moment at least. And this is what Michel-Henry calls the self-affection of the flesh. The impression that the flesh is making on itself. So this is an attempt to characterize the states that one reaches by making the epoche, the suspension of judgment. One can go so deep that even intentionality disappears. And here is the way Michel-Henry describes this kind of state. An original, absolutely original state. Original can only mean this, what comes in itself before any intentionality and independently of it, before the space of a gaze, before the outside oneself. So I think this can be close to open presence. Just pay attention to what there is without focusing attention to something outside oneself. So I told you that the flesh is that strange being endowed with reversibility, jointly perceived and self-perceiving. This triggered a very wild speculation in the last work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He said, okay, let's think. a little bit. We see things around us, but we doubt. What we feel more certainly is our own flesh. But the only point in which we have a direct contact with the world is in ourselves. In every other things, we have an indirect contact by vision, by anything. But when we dwell in ourselves, we are the world, literally. We coincide with the world. The world and ourselves are coincident in that point. We could say we are part of the world, but it's even better to say that in this point of the world self-senses itself. So what Merleau-Ponty tried is to elaborate a new ontology, but not an ontology of things, an ontology of participancy, participating into the world, and therefore not disconnecting oneself from this world. And in the framework of this ontology, plenty of new characterizations of events that were interpreted in a very different way, plenty of new interpretations of ordinary facts arise. For instance, vision. In the standard ontology, especially dualist ontology, you would say vision, it's what occurs when the light that comes from objects impinges on the sense organs of a subject. That's the ordinary way vision is described. But Maurice Merleau-Ponty said, no, all these things are one. There is no object and subject. There is this field of experience, and within this field of experience, something occurs. What? The self-splitting of all there is. And this self-splitting arises as a sensation of vision. Here is the sentence of Merleau-Ponty. Vision is the tool which allows me to contemplate from within the fission of being. It's a beautiful sentence, but maybe it's a little bit strange or cryptical or difficult or anything. No, it just means that vision is a manifestation of the self-splitting of the world. It self-splits, even though it's not two, but it self-splits in seen and seeing. And when you see, that means exactly that. That means that the world has split at some point. Which point? Yourself, at this very moment. Now, I will conclude with that. Phenomenology can be seen as a knowledge. For instance, Husserl wanted to know what he called eidetic invariance, namely, the constant features of experience that he could describe verbally. So he wanted to found a new science, a science of experience, as opposed to the science of things that are experienced. So there is a book by Husserl whose title is precisely Phenomenology as a Rigorous Science. So clearly, Husserl had the dream of founding a science of experience similar to mathematics, as rigorous as mathematics, and that would be the knowledge of the basic invariant states of mind. But phenomenology, as you have seen, has a method. The method is the epoche. And the epoche means deep inner transformation. So phenomenology is at the same time a discipline of knowledge of the mind, and it is also a discipline of existential transformation. Buddhism is a little bit different because in Buddhism, the knowledge itself is subordinate to the aim of existential transformation. You don't know just for the pleasure of knowing. You know because knowledge is the right way. And because ignorance is one of the reasons for going astray in samsara. But in phenomenology, knowledge is very much valued as an aim in itself, and existential transformation is a little bit secondary in the picture. So it's different, but the two things are connected nevertheless. So here are some sentences from phenomenologists who illustrate this ethical bearing of phenomenology. For instance, this one that I love. When I do a talk, I always quote this sentence because people say, "Oh, you are doing philosophy. Why are you doing philosophy? What is philosophy good for? How can we use it to do something?" And so on and so on. And Heidegger heard this question, and he answered, "We can do nothing with philosophy. Okay, it's useless. But philosophy can do something of us." So that means that philosophy is a tool for self-transformation. And Husserl, who said phenomenology implies a complete self-transformation, which can be compared to a religious conversion. And clearly, when you performed the epoche, you may have a deep emotion to understand that you can completely change your way of looking at the world. Personally, I had this experience. Maybe this experience I had while reading Husserl is not completely independent of the fact I am so interested in Buddhism. Okay. And recently I had a young student of mine, and she was asking for a subject, and I told her, "You should compare quantum mechanics and phenomenology." She said, "Well, yes, why not? But I don't know phenomenology." And I said, "Please learn, read this and that by some authors, Husserl and so on." She came back 2 weeks after in my office, and she said, "My life has been transformed." I opened the book by Husserl, and suddenly I realized that I had paid no attention to my mind, and now I understand that it's very important. And I remember experiences in my early childhood in which experience mattered a lot, and now I can connect all these things. So it's clear that it can be a self-transformation, a conversion, and so on and so on. Not as stable and strong as what you do by following teachings, by going step after step of the practice of meditation, but at least it's a glimpse. It can give you a glimpse. And here are other quotations by other phenomenologists. For instance, Eugen Fink, who was a disciple of Husserl. "The foundation of philosophy," he said, "is the original beginning of the philosopher." That means that in order to do good philosophy, you have to start from scratch, namely from yourself, from your own transformation. Or this quotation by Merleau-Ponty: "Philosophy is the set of questions in which what is at stake is the questioner." So completely reflective, you know. So if philosophy is a question about the questioner, then the questioner cannot remain untouched by the question. The answer to the question will transform itself. The answer to the question is the transformation of herself or himself. Here is, I think, the real depth of phenomenology. And here is another quote by Husserl, finally. "A true philosopher is the one who has taken the decision to make of his life a life devoted to the absolute, a life devoted to the idea of the supreme good. So clearly there is an ethical push in phenomenology. You perform the epoche not just for the sake of knowing more about your mind or for the pleasure of playing with your own state of consciousness and so on. You do the epoche because you want to go forward in the path of your life. And finally, last but not least, Husserl discovered Buddhism late in his life. He was given by some friends of his a German translation of this book, Samyutta Nikaya, of the Sutta Pitaka. And this German translation was to be published soon, but the authors of the translation wanted a very important philosopher of their time to make a preface, because they thought if a philosopher, a celebrated philosopher, writes a preface, then the book will sell better. Because Buddhism at that time was not very popular in Germany. So Husserl said, okay, let me read this book. He read the book and he was stunned. He said, gosh, these guys have understood everything. All I've understood in my life, they had understood that 2,000 years ago or more. So he was enthusiastic and wrote the preface. And here is what we find in the preface. Buddhism, he said, he wrote, is probably the highest flower of Indian religiosity. A religiosity which looks purely inward in vision and deed, which is not transcendent but transcendental. I hope you understand what this last bit means. You don't? Okay. Okay, transcendent. A transcendent religion means a religion in which there is belief in God. God is transcendent with respect to the world. Instead, in Buddhism, you don't have the belief in a transcendent God. But it is transcendental. Transcendental means exactly what I said earlier, quoting the Upanishads. Namely, it is interested in the field of consciousness that makes all appearance possible. That is the precondition for the appearance of anything, be it vision, hearing, smelling, thinking, or suffering. Anything, okay? So Buddhism is interested in that field that makes everything arising from it, including any act of mental work or consciousness. So Buddhism, according to Husserl, is not transcendent, but transcendental. Now, when you know Husserl, and now you know some of Husserl, you understand that this means a lot to him. That means that they are fully agree with him, with his philosophy, with phenomenology. Because phenomenology is, he calls himself, phenomenology is a transcendental discipline. So saying that Buddhism is transcendental means that it's similar to phenomenology. So Husserl recognized the kinship between phenomenology and Buddhism. And he added this. Buddhism is concerned with a religious and ethical method of the highest dignity for spiritual purification and pacification, a method thought through and carried out with an internal consistency, an energy, and a nobility of mind that are almost unmatched. Okay, so he was clearly very impressed. And by the way, an anecdote is that I read this quote to His Holiness when there was a conference in the University of Strasbourg in France, and His Holiness came. And I gave a talk about, an introduction to phenomenology and some connections with Buddhism. And I finished with this quote. And he took my arm and said, Michel, we should not say things like that too loudly, because people would think that we want to convert them to Buddhism. so we laughed. So thank you. I think it's a right conclusion, and I will stop there, this series. Thank you.